The telephone line crackled deep inside Allied headquarters as rain hammered the windows outside. It was late March 1945. Germany was collapsing. Entire Nazi divisions were retreating east in panic. Bridges were exploding behind them. Roads across the Reich were jammed with burning trucks, wounded soldiers, terrified civilians, and shattered columns of armor. The war in Europe was entering its final violent chapter. But inside a tense command room filled with cigarette smoke, maps, and exhausted officers, another battle was quietly reaching its breaking point. This battle was not between Germans and Allies. It was between two Allied generals who could barely stand each other anymore. And somewhere in the middle of that storm stood Winston Churchill, trying to stop the alliance itself from cracking apart before victory was secured. What happened over the next hours would become one of the most explosive moments inside the Allied command during World War II. One furious demand, one dangerous rivalry. One shocking response from Churchill that stunned the room into silence. Because while Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery was demanding consequences for George S. Patton, Churchill had already heard something that changed everything. Patton crossed last night. You can almost feel the cold air moving through Europe in March 1945. The Western Allies had already crossed into Germany from several directions. Cities burned day and night beneath constant bombing. German resistance was still deadly, but something had changed. The Wehrmacht no longer fought like an army expecting victory. It fought like a machine trying to delay the inevitable. Yet even in those final months, one obstacle still stood between the Allies and the heart of Germany: the Rhine River. The Rhine was not just a river. It was Germany's last great natural defense line in the West. Wide, freezing, and heavily guarded, it stretched like a steel barrier across the collapsing Reich. German commanders knew that once the Allies crossed it in force, the war inside Germany would accelerate toward disaster. Adolf Hitler himself ordered that every bridge be destroyed if necessary. The Rhine had to hold. But inside Allied headquarters, there was growing disagreement about how to attack it. Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery believed the final push into Germany needed discipline, preparation, and careful concentration of forces. Montgomery was methodical. He believed massive offensives should be carefully planned and tightly controlled. He preferred overwhelming strength over speed. To him, caution saved lives. General George S. Patton believed almost the exact opposite. Patton moved like a storm. His Third Army had ripped across France with shocking speed after the Normandy breakout in August 1944. His tanks seemed to appear where Germans least expected them. His men drove through mud, snow, frozen roads, and artillery fire with almost reckless aggression. Patton believed momentum itself was a weapon. If the enemy was retreating, you did not pause. You chased him until he collapsed. The problem was that Patton's personality terrified many Allied leaders almost as much as it inspired American troops. He was unpredictable, aggressive, sometimes reckless. He insulted allies, ignored political sensitivities, and constantly pushed beyond limits. British commanders often saw him as dangerous. Some American officers privately agreed. Even Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower spent enormous energy trying to manage Patton's ego while still using his battlefield brilliance. And no rivalry inside the Allied command burned hotter than the one between Montgomery and Patton. The tension between them had been building for months. It was not only military, it was personal. Montgomery viewed Patton as impulsive and obsessed with glory. Patton viewed Montgomery as slow, arrogant, and obsessed with publicity. Their victories became competitions. Their offensives became arguments. Their press coverage became political weapons. By March 1945, the rivalry had become almost unbearable. Montgomery had spent weeks preparing Operation Plunder, the massive Allied crossing of the Rhine near Wesel in northern Germany. This operation involved enormous planning, thousands of guns, massive airborne landings, carefully coordinated logistics. Montgomery intended it to be the decisive crossing that broke Germany open. But while Montgomery prepared his giant set-piece offensive, Patton was already moving. On March 22, 1945, near the town of Oppenheim south of Mainz, Patton's Third Army secretly reached the Rhine. The crossing point was unexpected. German defenses there were thinner than anticipated. Patton saw opportunity immediately. That night, American engineers quietly moved boats toward the river under darkness. Soldiers carried assault craft through mud and silence. Motors were rapped to reduce sound. Officers whispered orders instead of shouting them. Across the black water, German positions waited in uncertainty. The Rhine looked terrifying at night. Fast current. Bitter wind. Darkness stretching across both banks. You can almost imagine the sound of boots scraping wet metal as soldiers climbed into fragile boats knowing machine guns could open fire at any second. Then the crossing began. American troops slipped across the river before many German defenders even realized what was happening. Artillery thundered overhead. Engineers fought the current while tracer rounds suddenly cut through darkness. Some boats drifted off course. Others slammed into riverbanks under enemy fire. But the Americans kept moving. By dawn on March 23, Patton's men had established a bridgehead across the Rhine. The impossible had happened faster than almost anyone expected. Patton immediately sensed the political impact. He reportedly telephoned headquarters with satisfaction burning in his voice. He had crossed the Rhine before Montgomery launched his massive operation in the north. The cautious British Field Marshal had spent weeks preparing his grand assault. Patton had crossed with speed, improvisation, and surprise. To Patton, this was more than military success. It was proof. And soon the news reached Allied headquarters. Inside command centers across Europe, reactions were immediate. Some officers were stunned. Others were furious. British commanders in particular feared Patton's actions could disrupt broader planning. Montgomery had expected his crossing operation to dominate Allied strategy and headlines. Instead, Patton had suddenly seized momentum. The timing could not have been worse for Allied unity. Reports began flying between headquarters. Discussions turned heated. Montgomery was already frustrated by what he saw as Patton's constant freelancing and self-promotion. Now the American general had crossed Germany's greatest river barrier, ahead of schedule, and outside Montgomery's carefully controlled framework. For Montgomery, it was not just irritating, it was dangerous. The deeper issue beneath the anger was command authority. Montgomery believed coordinated operations required discipline and centralized planning. If Patton's aggressive actions disrupted strategic priorities, the entire Allied front could become chaotic. Worse, Patton's growing fame threatened the balance of influence between British and American leadership during the final phase of the war. The British Empire had entered the war in 1939. By 1945, however, American industrial power and manpower increasingly dominated Allied operations. Churchill understood this reality painfully well. Britain was still influential, but the center of military power was shifting west across the Atlantic. Montgomery often felt pressure to defend British prestige within the alliance. Patton represented the opposite force. Loud, aggressive, American confidence pushing forward at full speed. As reports continued arriving, tempers exploded behind closed doors. Officers later described meetings filled with sharp exchanges, accusations, and visible anger. Some British commanders believed Patton endangered Allied coordination by constantly acting independently. Some Americans argued Montgomery moved too slowly and cared too much about credit. Caught between these competing personalities stood Eisenhower. The supreme commander understood both men better than almost anyone. He knew Montgomery's caution often produced organized success. He also knew Patton's aggression repeatedly shattered German defenses when speed mattered most. Removing either commander risked damaging the Allied war effort, but maintaining peace between them was becoming nearly impossible. Then came the demand. Some accounts differ on the exact wording and timing, but tension surrounding Patton's behavior and independent action reached a point where Montgomery strongly pushed for consequences against him. Whether framed as formal removal, disciplinary action, or demands to restrain him, the message was clear. Patton had gone too far. Inside British circles, frustration with Patton had been building for a long time already. Many still remembered earlier controversies, including the Sicily slapping incidents in 1943, when Patton struck exhausted American soldiers suffering from combat stress. Those scandals nearly destroyed his career. Eisenhower had protected him then, but distrust remained. Now, after the Rhine crossing, critics believed Patton's ambition was again overriding discipline. Churchill listened carefully as pressure mounted. The British Prime Minister admired boldness in war, but he also understood coalition politics. Every decision carried consequences beyond the battlefield. If British and American commanders openly turned against each other during the final attack on Germany, the alliance could suffer severe damage at the worst possible moment. Churchill knew personalities mattered in war. He had worked with difficult commanders for years. Some were cautious, some reckless, some brilliant, some vain. But victory often depended on using flawed men effectively instead of searching for perfect ones. Still, the pressure continued. Montgomery was one of Britain's most respected commanders. His victory at El Alamein in 1942 had transformed Allied morale during a dark stage of the war. Churchill could not simply dismiss his concerns. Montgomery genuinely believed unified strategy was being threatened, but Churchill had also seen something else over the years. He had watched Patton's army move faster than almost anyone thought possible. He had watched German commanders repeatedly fail to predict him. He had watched American momentum grow stronger every month. And then new information arrived. Patton's crossing was succeeding. Bridgeheads were expanding. German resistance near Oppenheim was weakening. Engineers were already building bridges across the Rhine. American armor would soon pour into the German interior. The gamble had worked. Suddenly, the political atmosphere changed. You can almost picture the moment inside the room. Officers waiting, maps spread across tables, cigarette smoke hanging under dim lights. Montgomery furious. Messages arriving every few minutes. Churchill staring at fresh reports while understanding the larger picture before others fully grasped it. The war was ending. Fast. And the general causing all the trouble had just delivered one of the most important operational victories of the entire Western campaign. That was when Churchill reportedly delivered the line that cut through the tension like a knife. Patton crossed last night. The words landed with brutal simplicity. Not tomorrow. Not planned for next week. Not waiting for permission. Patton had already done it. The argument suddenly sounded different after that. Because military history is filled with moments where success changes everything. Actions criticized before victory often become celebrated afterward. Churchill understood this reality deeply. Results mattered, and Patton's results were impossible to ignore. The Rhine crossing transformed the strategic situation inside Germany almost immediately. Once Allied forces crossed in multiple areas, German defensive coherence began collapsing rapidly. Roads clogged with retreating units. Fuel shortages crippled movement. Communications broke down. American armored divisions drove deeper into central Germany with terrifying speed. Patton's Third Army became one of the most aggressive forces in the final weeks of the war. His men advanced through shattered towns, forests, and collapsing German lines with relentless momentum. Prison camps were discovered. Supply depots captured. Entire enemy formations surrendered in huge numbers. German civilians stared silently as endless American convoys rolled eastward. Yet the rivalry inside Allied command never fully disappeared. Even after victory, Montgomery and Patton continued criticizing each other publicly and privately. Their personalities were simply too different. Montgomery believed Patton lacked discipline. Patton believed Montgomery lacked aggression. Churchill remained caught between admiration and frustration toward both men. He respected Montgomery's professionalism and organizational skill. But he also admired offensive spirit. Churchill had long believed wars were won by action, daring, and momentum. Patton embodied those qualities in ways that were often difficult to control, but impossible to ignore. There was also another uncomfortable truth many British leaders recognized by 1945. The Americans were becoming dominant. Factories across the United States produced tanks, trucks, aircraft, ammunition, fuel, and supplies on a scale Britain could no longer match. American manpower seemed endless compared to exhausted European armies. Command influence naturally followed that power. Patton represented this new reality almost symbolically. loud American confidence charging across Europe while old imperial structures struggled to adapt. Churchill understood geopolitics as much as military strategy. He knew the post-war world was already taking shape even before Germany surrendered. Britain would remain important, but the balance of power was shifting toward the United States and the Soviet Union. Inside that larger transformation, conflicts between Montgomery and Patton carried deeper meaning than simple personality clashes. They represented two military cultures colliding during history's largest war. One careful, measured, traditional, and methodical. The other fast, aggressive, industrial, and relentless. And on the night Patton crossed the Rhine, the balance tilted decisively toward speed. The crossing itself became legendary almost immediately. Patton later claimed he even urinated into the Rhine in symbolic triumph, though historians debate details of the story. True or not, the image perfectly matched his reputation. Bold, provocative, impossible to ignore. German commanders understood the seriousness instantly. Generaloberst Johannes Blaskowitz and other officers realized Western Germany could no longer be defended effectively once major Allied bridgeheads spread across the Rhine. Hitler continued issuing impossible orders, demanding resistance everywhere, but reality was collapsing faster than ideology. Within weeks, Allied forces would surround the Ruhr pocket, trapping hundreds of thousands of German troops. The Third Reich was dying. Yet even during those final victories, Allied leaders worried constantly about maintaining unity. The Soviet Red Army was pushing west from the east with enormous force. Political tensions about post-war Europe already simmered beneath the surface. No one wanted internal Allied fractures before Germany officially surrendered. That was one reason Churchill's response carried such weight. He was not simply defending Patton personally. He was recognizing that battlefield momentum could not be sacrificed to pride, politics, or rivalry during the final destruction of Nazi Germany. The irony is that Patton himself remained deeply controversial even among Americans. Many admired him passionately, others considered him unstable. His speeches were often inflammatory. His language shocked politicians and journalists. His behavior sometimes created diplomatic disasters. But his soldiers frequently adored him. Third Army veterans later described the strange electricity Patton created around units under his command. Men exhausted from weeks of combat somehow pushed harder when they believed Patton expected movement. Convoys drove through night storms. Tanks advanced despite fuel shortages. Entire divisions seemed infected by his aggression. He demanded speed constantly. And in March 1945, that speed broke through Germany's final western shield before many expected it possible. Montgomery never stopped believing his own approach was strategically wiser. To be fair, many historians argue his caution saved lives during difficult operations. Operation Plunder itself succeeded effectively when launched. Massive airborne assaults supported the crossing. British and Canadian forces advanced successfully. But history often remembers moments emotionally, not mathematically. And emotionally, Patton stealing the Rhine crossing spotlight before Montgomery's grand operation became one of the defining symbolic moments of the Allied advance into Germany. Churchill saw the symbolism immediately. The war was entering its final act. Momentum mattered not just militarily, but psychologically. Allied populations wanted signs that victory was close. Soldiers wanted proof Germany was collapsing. Headlines about unexpected Rhine crossings fed that growing sense of unstoppable advance. Patton understood publicity naturally. Montgomery understood it too, though differently. Both men cared deeply about reputation. Both understood history was being written in real time. That made their rivalry even more explosive. Eisenhower continued balancing personalities until the war ended. His greatest leadership skill may not have been battlefield tactics at all, but coalition management, keeping British, American, Canadian, and other Allied forces working together despite massive egos required extraordinary patience. Without that unity, Nazi Germany might have prolonged the war far longer. And Churchill, despite his dramatic personality and famous speeches, often acted as a stabilizing political force behind the scenes. He understood emotional commanders needed careful handling. He understood timing. Most importantly, he understood victory had to come before personal grievances. That is why his response became unforgettable. Patton crossed last night. Simple words. But behind them stood a brutal truth. History moves fast during war.